story starts off quite simply. These are the things I know are true. My name is Lu Ling Liu Yang. The names of my husbands were Pan Kai Jin. Both of them dead in our sequence. She was born in a water All of my stories are so much emotionally based on my family. So if the things are not exactly true, emotionally it has to do with our family. So my grandmother was somebody who was forced in a position of subservience later in life. And she found the only way she could gain her power was to kill herself. She was raped by a man who was well-to-do, and she had nowhere else to go. She had lost face, and she had to join this man's household because she was now pregnant. This is the same woman. This is my grandmother. This is also my mother, and she is a little girl. All of these women committed suicide. And my mother always talked about killing herself. So you see this sense of trauma continuing through the ages, and I just wonder how many of their mothers also ended up killing themselves. To me, it's a story about 3 generations of women who each have been voiceless in their own ways.
Your whole world destroyed, black as ink. This long...
Before I started work on this opera, I had no appreciable exposure to Chinese culture. I mean, real Chinese culture. I live in New York, adjacent to Chinatown. I grew up eating Chinese food every week. I didn't know anything really about the music, so this has been a huge learning curve for me. I fell in love with the culture. I was intoxicated by the energy and the spirit. I fell in love with the place. The director for the opera is Chen Shizheng, who's known by many people for his Peony Pavilion, which was the first time in 500 years that this classic Chinese opera was done in its entirety.
I love Amy's work, and I love Stewart's music, and I thought just a great opportunity to work with these 2 artists and to make something wonderful. Sort of a new American opera.
During the course of this first trip, I actually met a musician, Li Zhonghua, the percussionist who is from one of the Beijing opera troupes. When she sees him as a ghost, how is it different? And we asked him this question: what does it sound like for a ghost to speak to a living person? And he said, I've got it. So he got up and he pulled up the Xiaoluo, which is the little gong, and it, gang, 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 gang. And then he goes like this. He takes his hands and he goes. It was like an explosion in my head because I realized that he wasn't just playing notes. He saw everything, and that the images, the text, the sound, the costumes, the gestures, the movements, all of that was part of the same thing for him. And I realized very clearly at that moment that we couldn't just teach somebody to play those instruments, that what we would lose is that whole world.
Chinese opera performers are required to be a total performer, where the vocabulary and the character is expressed equally important in the gesture language, in body language, and the facial expression. If you can get the best of two worlds, then you can really create something very intricate, a mixture of the good parts of both opera traditions.
Stand straight, no coquette, be polite, no talking back. Be smart, number one, don't have fun. Both are stuck, yeah.
I'm hoping people would say, this is good opera. And that the people who otherwise would never go to opera, what they would have is a cathartic emotional experience, just as I've had.
A few words about this evening's guests. I've read that Amy Tan was destined to be a concert pianist by her mother. But instead, she settled on writing fiction. And of course, her novels include The Joy Luck Club, The Kitchen God's Wife, The 100 Secret Senses, The Bonesetter's Daughter, and Saving Fish from Drowning, all New York Times bestsellers. Amy Tan is also the extraordinarily talented librettist for The Bonesetter's Daughter. Stewart Wallace grew up in Texas playing in a rock and roll band and singing as a cantor in his synagogue. A self-taught composer, he began writing music at 8 years old and wrote his first opera as his thesis at the University of Texas at Austin. His major breakthrough came with his fifth opera, Harvey Milk, which debuted in Houston before traveling to New York, San Francisco, and Germany. Ken Smith is a North American correspondent for Gramophone magazine and also serves as the Asian performing arts critic for the Financial Times. In his new book, Fate, Luck, Chance, Amy Tan, Stewart Wallace, and the Making of the Bonesetter's Daughter opera, he chronicles the collaboration between Amy Tan and Stewart Wallace in creating this new opera. Would you welcome them again, please? Stewart, why don't we get right to music at the very beginning? I believe we have a special guest, two guests this evening. Would you tell us about them and introduce it for us?
Well, actually, you've met them already because they're in this video that you've seen. The first person that we met on my first trip to Beijing with Amy in 2004, we were looking to learn about Chinese percussion. And the scene that you saw here was what happened at that moment because Joanna Lee, Ken's wife, said to us, bring a video camera, you have 3 hours. So the reason we have videotape is because of Joanna. And we met Zhonghua, Li Zhonghua, and he was there to tell us about Chinese percussion, but we started asking these questions. Amy asked him a narrative question. What does it sound like for a ghost to speak to a living person? And when we watched Zhonghua, and I think you see what happened there, it was as if a whole world was opening up. And really, because Zhonghua was so special in who he is, and because he also had this kind of wide, expansive vision, he actually was the opening of the door for all the other Chinese musicians who eventually joined us in this opera. It was because of Zhonghua's spirit, personality, knowledge, mastery, that then opened up a whole channel of exploration for all of us. That was a very, very important moment, and from that time till now, which is 4+ years, Li Zhonghua and I have worked together to kind of create a language that was Chinese in timbre and texture and American rhythmic, meaning my language in terms of the music. It was a real melding, I think, of our minds and an expression of our friendship that grew very deep over that time. So I'm delighted that Zhonghua is here tonight. With him is Chen Yi. And you saw Chen Yi in those clips from Peony Pavilion, and you also saw her draw the sword across her throat. And Chen Yi was the star of the 19-hour Peony Pavilion production. I went to see it in Charleston, met Chen Yi then, and I passed her backstage because she didn't look anything like this woman on the stage, this creature that you see here. And I realized, Amy and I started talking about this character of Precious Auntie, who is the keeper of the tradition, the embodiment of the past. And as you remember, or those of you who have read the book, you might remember that Precious Auntie doesn't speak. She gestures and grunts and does all these things, and we didn't know if she would actually sing or how much she would sing. And so the idea that Chen Yi had this mastery, both of physical and vocal expression, was something that was very encouraging to us and left all these things wide open. I want to say two things about these artists before I introduce you to them on the stage here. They both came from worlds that are completely apart from the world of classical opera or Western opera. When Zhonghua plays a performance in Beijing with his Beijing Opera Company, he's the conductor. He's the leader. He's the master of his universe. When he comes here, it's a situation that's completely foreign. Not only the environment and the language, the musical setup is different. He has to follow a conductor. He leads his section, but it's a completely topsy-turvy thing that he allowed himself to be put through. And I often say that he's got a lot of guts to have come here and put himself in this situation.
That's not exactly what you say.
I say he's got a lot of balls, which he does. So does Chen Yi, by the way. Because Chen Yi also, in a very similar way, I mean, we did a press conference here, and somebody asked Chen Yi, what's it like to sing in this Western opera? And she said, well, when I do a Chinese opera performance, if I stop and drink a glass of tea, everybody waits for me. She says, here, nobody waits for me. I have to follow him, and she points to the conductor, and she says, so I have a question for you. What's your cell phone number? As you can imagine, it's been an absolute delight to work with these two startling artists who are really masters of their own worlds, and what they did for us is bring that world into the world of the Bonesetter's Daughter. Another really wonderful result of this is that we have in the opera people who would never work together in China. Zhonghua and Chen Yi would never perform together. Zhonghua is in Beijing opera. Chen Yi is in Kunju. Different kind of Chinese opera. We also have a Chinese rock singer who's a sheng master. We have Chinese acrobats. None of them would be on the stage together, much less with opera singers. Although born in China and some trained in China initially, none of them would be on the stage together as they are here. And I think that's an expression of the kind of American polyglot soul of this opera, which is truly an American opera that has distinct and strong roots in China, but the feeling, the perspective, and everything is decidedly American. So as Chen Yi and Li Zhonghua come up to the stage, we'll tell you a little bit about the scene they're going to perform. Zhonghua will play the ban, which is the traditional Chinese percussion accompaniment, and Chen Yi will sing something that was really crafted from the soul or spirit of the things that she does in traditional Chinese opera, but it's not traditional at all. I think Amy will tell you a little bit about what the scene's about.
I think with a lot of mothers and daughters, there are moments in which a daughter will say to her mother, I don't want to listen to what you have to say. In fact, I hate you. I wish you weren't my mother. I wish you were dead, and things like that. And that happens in the mother-daughter scene with Ruth, the present-day scene she's recalling that, or her mother's recalling that Ruth had said those things when she was 12. And then we go into the past, and Lu Ling is looking at her relationship with her mother, Precious Auntie. And when she says, I hate you, everybody hates you, Precious Auntie gives her a slap, but then looks at her hands and says, the ultimate mother guilt song, which is, she just tells you how much she sacrificed, how much pain she went through, and were you grateful? No, doesn't matter. I'm going to wait. I'm going to be patient. And That is the song. One of the things that happened when we knew Chen Yi would be part of the opera is that I began looking at, for the libretto, imagery that I could put into in these words that would allow her to interpret that in a way that was part of her unique repertoire, her skills, and this is Chen Yi.
Chen Yi and Li Zhonghua.
Look at these hands, once tender, once soft. When you were a baby, a pot of boiling soup nearly fell upon your head. I made my hands into a bowl. The blisters lasted nearly a year. Didn't matter. When you were feverish one winter night, I warmed an icicle between my palms, drop by drop into your wailing mouth. My hands turned blue, my fingernails nearly fell off. Didn't matter. Didn't matter. 1 year were 5. I showed you bones from a dragon cave, my family secret. 4,000 years. We lowered ourselves through brambles and gullies, past snakes and thorns, into the bottom of the world. I lay on my stomach. You rode my back. As I slithered like a worm into the lightless tunnel, I clawed out a bone so rare and offered it to you. You didn't care. I told myself, be patient. Wait. What is rare? What is genuine? What is longest lasting secret stuff? I made my hand into a ball.
What a treat for us to hear this beautiful selection, don't you think? Yeah. If you have already attended the opera, you are very blessed. If you have tickets, you are very lucky. If you don't have tickets, we all feel sorry for you. We hope that you will be able to get them. Elaine tells me that this is a good time for you to complete your cards, and we're going to be collecting them a moment when we get to our questions and answers. So if you would be writing those now, we will make sure that we can collect them a bit later. So do they have them now, Denise? They have the cards? Okay, please. And could we go ahead and begin to collect those cards, if we could, please, ushers, if you would do that.
And Craig,
yes.
You know that that's Chen Yi up there in the blonde wig.
That's right, yeah. And that is one of the appearances that happens at the beginning. I did have the fortune and privilege to go see the opera. It was magnificent. It touched me in ways I never dreamed it would. It was a uniting of music and language and dance and acrobatics, and more than that, it was something deeply cathartic and emotional for me in terms of cleansing. Thank you for doing that. I really, truly appreciate that. Amy, before this project, librettist, had you thought of yourself as a librettist before? Well, tell us, how did this happen?
Well, you know, part of the reason why I never would have thought of myself as a librettist is I had, like many people, I had no idea how people write libretto. You know, did the music come first? Did you have to write weird line lengths to, you know, suit opera? Did you have this archaic language? Did you have to, you know, I was one step above, do I have to start writing in Italian and then translate it later? I actually had people ask me that, you know, did you do it in Italian?
We all like to do it in Italian.
Yeah, you know, so it was this mysterious process, and it was really because of Stewart, who was very pushy, and he wanted to do this as an opera, Bonesetter's Daughter, and we had a librettist, or what I call the real librettist, Michael Corey, who has done many operas with Stewart. And Michael is so talented and so sought after. He had all his projects that he put in for, you know, come true. And he was busy working on so many things, he didn't have time really to get going at the speed that Stewart wanted. So Stewart just says, well, just write something, you know. And so, you know, and he can tell you more about what that was like, but I was tricked.
Do you plan to do it again?
You know, it was such a wonderful experience, and boy, I mean, look what's happened. I'm just afraid it would never be quite as good. It was an opera graduate class, one-to-one instruction, but I also have to remind myself I'm a fiction writer, and that's my first love, and I need to do that and go back into that world. It's really tempting.
One quick follow-up on that. How do you telescope a very intricate novel with many subplots and plots into a 2-hour period?
Well, you know, in the beginning, we did with Michael, we were trying to do something that encapsulated many of the scenes. And eventually, when we were working together, I went back to what we had done, what I had done with the screenwriter Ron Bass for the movie. Mm-hmm. And that is basically to start with the heart and the soul of the story and start over again. And you didn't really need at that point to think, oh, I'm going to have to cut out this and I will use that. It's just simply created from afresh. The emotions of the opera are the same as the emotions of the book because they are the emotions of my life. So those are not changeable. And then we could play with it. It was really very free. And I ended up putting in scenes that don't exist in the book or melding them in a different way. We would get to a certain point and talk about where we were in the opera and what we wanted to reverberate or resonate musically and in the story, and we'd just say, oh, I know, we can just add that thing in there. You know, it was very free. So.
Stewart, I called you Steve, I apologize.
That's right, our conductor's Steve, it happens all the time.
Stewart, the prologue just grabs you at the beginning, and the three-part woman's beginning is something that's really stunning. I heard that this was something separate from the opera in the beginning. Could you tell us about that?
Well, it wasn't really separate. I mean, there was no opera at that point.
Oh.
When The Bonesetter's Daughter came out, a mutual friend of Amy's and mine, Serena Tang, had decided to make a big celebration. It was a big birthday, and the book was out, and she called me and she said, well, would you write something? You know, Amy always says, it's like saying, you know, well, my kid's having a birthday, would you write a novel?
I mean, the only answer is no.
But I don't know, I said yes. And
fate.
Right, luck.
Luck. Chance. Insanity.
Right, all of the above. And I hadn't read the book, so I took the first line of the book, these are the things I know are true, and I said it for 3 women, a cappella. I didn't know there were 3 women in the book. So I gave it to Amy as an offering, you know, just to celebrate her book and our friendship. And I didn't think about it, and then I read the book. And as I was reading the book, I had this, sinking feeling is the wrong word, but I had this kind of gradual and then more sudden realization that this was an opera. That I saw this as an opera. And I called Amy and I said, look, I'm really excited about this. I think we can make an opera about the Bonesetter's Daughter. And she said, I don't know. I think we're going to do something else with it. I just can't think about that now. So I said, okay, fine. I kind of let it go. Because you never enter into this, and I think Amy knows now, you never do this lightly. It's a real voyage. And after about 9 months, I couldn't shake it. And I called Amy up and I said, look, not only do I know this has to be an opera, I know how to do it. Remember that trio with the 3 women? If we start with the 3 women as part of each other, singing these interlocking words, then we can move backwards and forwards in time with impunity, with freedom. And that's the point where I saw her eyes start to kind of light up. And she denies this, by the way. And she said, okay, let's do it. And that's where we started. So they were really 2 separate things. One was just a gift. And what happened is that this moment, this gift, or this was a kind of seed that we later found was a seed. I didn't know it at the time.
You know, I don't think it was that so much as I was lighting up because of what you said. It was the idea that I would learn about opera. It was this chance to take this course in opera. And I thought, no matter what happens, if it never reaches the stage, why would I not take advantage of this? The only thing was, I didn't know it was going to take so much time. You know, I thought, yeah, sure, you know, why not? Great.
Well, see, I interpreted it differently. So this is
I
the beginning
know.
of Rashomon,
I had
you know?
no idea how much time it was going to take.
No, of course not. Nobody does.
It still was worth, you know, whatever time it was going to be worth it. But I had no idea. If you told me it was going to just consume everything in my life and drive me crazy and give me bouts of anxiety and sleeplessness and gnashing of teeth, then I would have said no.
Why would I have told you that?
I know.
Well, Ken, you come to this from a different perspective. You've written your new book, Fate, Luck, and Chance. I happen to have it here in my hand. And tell us about how you got involved in this project, and would you give us a little bit, help us to eavesdrop on the process between our two our two guests here too?
Well, I came into this project about 2004. I'd known Stewart since Harvey Milk a little bit, but really in an opera he did that was produced subsequently to that, Hopper's Wife. And Hopper's Wife started with the premise that Edward Hopper, the painter, was married to Hedda Hopper, the gossip columnist. And in the course of those 90 minutes, everything that Stewart could come up with out of Michael Corey's libretto had this juxtaposition of East Coast versus West Coast, and high art versus low art, and Puritanism versus liberalism and libertarianism, and the idea that you scratch the surface and you find out people are actually are very different underneath the facade. All of this was a very American opera, and it was to the point where, unlike a lot of the big epic tales, this actually was something that didn't answer a lot of questions or didn't try to be the great American opera. It just was. And it opened up a debate where, you walk out, still pondering the questions that are still there, and it sort of invited you into the process. And so that was how I knew Stewart probably most. And a few years later, he called me up about a piece that he had just written, a guitar concerto for electric guitar and the National Symphony Orchestra. And again, this was not an opera, but it had a story. The story was about his trip back to the Ukraine, where he was visiting the village of his grandparents, and tried to, in a way, recreate the story of their coming back, and really to find commonality, to find a common ground with his ancestry. And he gave me a piece of music and said, well, listen to this. And then we talked about a few other things along the way. He said, well, what have you been doing, Ken? And I said, well, I've been spending a lot of time in China. What have you been doing, Stewart? Well, I'm writing an opera with Amy Tan. And it was like, I think we need to talk.
Yes.
And at that point, we weren't really thinking about the electric guitar concerto, but I went home and I heard it. And Stewart played, he's prefaced it by saying that this is Hebrew cantorial singing filtered through Mississippi swamp blues, which I thought was the most ridiculous thing I heard until I heard it. And the description was absolutely perfect. He found this space where he could communicate with his ancestors, where all the differences of chronology, of geography, they were existing in this time and place where they could meet on a certain ground. And as soon as I heard that, I realized he knew exactly what Amy was about. Amy wasn't about the Chineseness, it was about the Americanness. And the idea that you search and try to find a common ground however you can, to where you can talk to your mother in her youth and your grandmother and find out, where you really meet, and apart from all the accidents that make you different, where you're the same.
Amy, that begs a question too. Comes up with, it seems as though the theme of mother-daughter wounds is a prominent theme, not only in the opera, but I've heard that this is partially autobiographical for you. How did you get to this theme? And could you tell us a little bit about this process?
It's funny. It became more and more autobiographical as we started writing this. The Bonesetter's Daughter, there were moments in there that were about my life at the time I was writing it. My mother had just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, so I was dealing with that. And at one point, I realized she had Alzheimer's when she, at a family dinner, started talking about the O.J. trial and told everybody at the table that she had been there and she witnessed the whole thing. And I thought she was confused. Her English wasn't so good, so I said, you mean you saw the documentary? And she said, no, I was there. And I said, you mean blah, blah, blah? And she said, no, I was there. And I realized something was seriously wrong. I said, how'd you get down there? She said, I don't know, but I was there. And she started to describe what she saw. And it was as though she saw it right in front of her. And I was horrified because I was seeing that my mother had Alzheimer's and she would die of this disease. So the story that I wrote about the Bonesetter's Daughter was a lot about memory and what things that we should remember and things that we should forget and things that we should remember but are forgotten unless somebody is there to tell us and what these secrets are. There were a number of other parts of the opera that were not in The Bonesetter's Daughter. One is the very last moment in the opera in which the mother is dying. And the mother does not die in The Bonesetter's Daughter, but it had to do with the mother saying to the daughter that she was sorry for hurting her when she was a little girl, and saying that she didn't remember what she had done, but she knew she had hurt her. And her daughter is now an adult and has gone through a lot, has gone through being in China with her, and says, no, no, there was nothing, there was nothing. And she says, no, I did something. And that was a conversation my mother had before she died. She was barely able to say anything. She was no longer able to talk into a telephone. But one day, it was as though her mind cleared, and she called me from assisted living, and she said, Amy, I am so scared. I don't know where I am. I don't remember where I live. And I said, we often don't remember where we live. And she said, no, I think I'm going crazy, but I also know I did something terrible to you. And she kept saying, but I don't remember what it is. I just know I hurt you. And I want to say that I hope that you can forget just as I've forgotten. Those words hit me as I was then the 6-year-old girl who always wanted my mother to say, I'm sorry. It was so healing, so wonderful. It was like a miracle that she came back up again and was able to say that. There is another scene in the opera that is not in the book. And again, it's the very last scene. My mother wanted me to buy her a mink coat. And there's a funny thing that's in the opera about the mink coat. But at the very end of her life, just before she lost consciousness, I was with her, sleeping in her bed with her for the last 2.5 weeks. But there was this one moment before she lost consciousness, and she saw her mother up. She looked up, and she said, "Nya nya, nya nya," which is Shanghainese for mother. And she motioned to the mink coat, which she called her best things, and she said to give it to her mother. And I was pretending, and she was like, hurry, ask her to sit down, and all that. She's gesturing, so I put the mink coat somewhere where it seemed like the ghost of my grandmother would be. And later I took the coat to put over my mother because it was getting cold, and my mother, who's supposed to have Alzheimer's, she said, yeah, that's, the grandmother. So she remembered that what she believed she saw. And it was such a touching moment because it was like a talisman at that point. This mink coat, which was the proof of my gratitude for her advice when I was growing up. So it was things like that that went into the opera that became deeply personal.
Yes.
And that's, I think part of it is what opera is so much about emotion. And the emotion is conveyed through the music. And my role as librettist was to provide a form, an emotional form that then would be handed to Stewart, and he would give that voice.
Well, speaking of Stewart, Stewart, tell us a little bit about what it took to do this opera, the kind of time that it took. Were you able to devote any other projects, any time for any other projects during this, or?
Well, I just want to say something about what Amy just said, because these kinds of things were an example of the way we worked together, and we really had an amazing time, because we had a kind of framework. We had this book that was our starting point, but because we had a strong structure and a framework, and we knew where we were going with the opera, we could play. And so much of the time that we spent together working on this opera was joyful and playful, and we would discover things together. It was an incredible journey, and also a ton of fun. I mean, we really had a blast.
Hilarious, and I'd say, Stewart, don't order the the fatty food, your cholesterol's too high. We ate a lot of good breakfast at a nearby restaurant, Balthazar's in New York, and it was fun.
But Stewart, how do you grasp those emotional moments like the end of the opera? That can't be just fun.
Well, I'll tell you
that has to be much deeper.
No.
Fun.
Look, fun was the joy of the making. There's a lot of hard work. It was 3 years of solid labor with nothing else. And that included every year we went to China. We spent about a month each time. So there was a significant amount of work. But, sometimes you work hard and it's a drudge. And sometimes you work hard and it's rewarding. And sometimes you work hard in the best circumstances and it's joyful. And this was truly joyful. In the end, that last scene was not supposed to be the end of the opera. Originally, we were going to have a funeral at the end. And Amy, I was up at the MacDowell Colony, and Amy sent me this text for the end, and it started, "My body so light, like inside clouds." And I started playing around with just this phrase, and then suddenly this musical idea came to me. And there was the melodic line, which was, "My body so light, like inside clouds, my memory floating away. So many things like ghosts, gone but still here." And when I got that idea, and I felt that the music, there's so many elements in the opera. There's Chinese percussion section, there's swanaz, there are all these other things going on. At this point, I felt like everything had to be stripped away. And that what we needed was to create this kind of sense of suspension, where we were at that membrane between life and death, where things hang in the balance. And these words really inspired that. And so I called Amy up from the airport on my way home from MacDowell, and I started to sing her these lines. She said, "Were you singing to me in the airport?"
Yeah. Who's there?
She says, "What's the cleaning lady doing?" But I said, I think this is the end of the opera. There's nowhere else to go. And so we had a game plan, which we largely followed, but we also really allowed our instincts and the emotional truths of the narrative and the emotional through line in the music to carry us. And we trusted that always. And, it was what happens in the second act is we start with everybody. We have a big chorus. Then it's down to Chang, the bad guy who gets his penis cut off, and 3 women. And then it's just the 3 women. And then it's the end. And it's like this gradual winnowing down of what was a very broad canvas down to the essentials of these 3 women and their stories, and what happens when Lu Ling leaves this earth and leaves in Ruth the stories of her family that she finally knows, and it connects her to this long line. And it's also those stories. I mean, one of the things I thought was so operatic about the book was that in the book you have this idea that we are affected by our family histories and the stories of our family, whether we know them or not, that we carry them within us. This is a very musical idea, and it also had tremendous resonance for me with, say, Harvey Milk and other things that I'd done. So that sang to me, and also there was this incredible ghost character of Precious Auntie.
Just one more question about that. Some people say that music is the language of the emotions. Do you, when you conceived of this final piece, do you feel something before it begins, or do you just write and then something happens after you write? What do you do in conceiving some musical lines?
Well, I don't accept the conception until I feel what it's supposed to be. And I often liken the role of a composer in an opera to that of a director in a film, because what the composer does is controls the rhythm at which the information is delivered, the kind of way that it affects you emotionally, the way that things get into you. And so I have to actually be able to feel each character. I have to feel their personalities, the shape of their musical line. But the first thing that has to happen at the very beginning, and I think this is probably true in writing novels too, is that I have to imagine a world. What does that world sound like? That's the hardest part. You're looking at the blank page and you're thinking, I want to make an opera that is obviously in my language and American, but that feels like China. How do you do that? It's very easy to say. And so you start to imagine a world, and then the world at a certain point takes over. And it tells you what's right and what's not. And you either trust it or you don't.
You know, I just want to say, you're listening to this, and wouldn't you want to have a course where you're just hearing this, how music is made and what people think about and musical language? I mean, it was so amazing to have this creative experience from the musical side and think about it in terms of what I do on the fiction side, but you know, and how these things are similar, very similar in what we look for in a voice.
Ken, you observed all of this going on between Amy and Stewart, but you also interviewed so many other people and observed a lot of other things in your book. And I'm told that this is the only place where we can find the complete libretto.
That is
have
true.
The complete libretto.
Yeah, a lot of the observation took place on the bus, which was a very interesting thing, is traveling through China. A lot of that took place, and when you read these, it flows as a virtual conversation in a way. But all of these were taken largely sometimes out of context. Sometimes in small groups, sometimes in public forums, sometimes, you know, I keep telling them that they need to get some new stories because they've been saying the same stories for a lot, but there are little things that change, little details that change, and they keep, as you know, they think of things at the moment. And so I like to get the idea of them playing off of each other, which was much the case. We talked to basically all of the people who were involved in this. And I don't just mean the director, Chen Shizheng. I don't just mean Han Feng, the costume designer, but also the singers, to a ridiculous degree, were involved in the collaborative process. You know, we were speaking with Zhang Sao, the soprano who plays, the mezzo who plays Ruth, the Amy Tan surrogate character, as we call it, but the daughter figure in the story. She's done contemporary music, but she gets the complete score. And she sometimes talks to the composer, and they might have a little change. She was in touch with Stewart before the role was written in Bonesetter's Daughter. I think all of the singers had worked with you before their role was really in place. And not just the music, but also many times the text came out of what those singers could do, sometimes what, in the case of Chen Yi in particular, gestures that she could make out of the Chinese opera tradition. And as Amy has said many times, consonants, very percussive things, rhythmic things that would set something off in Stewart. They had a wonderful relationship that, again, is not normal.
Yeah.
And you know, there are many librettists out there, and there are very few people who actually are full-time librettists. I mean, they're usually novelists, playwrights, whatever. And one of my favorite comments from a librettist was, well, you know, it's like a film script. You turn in the libretto, and then you get your opening night tickets in the mail. You know, there's no other connection. And here, that is an exaggeration only in a slight degree. There are a lot of librettists who come in, they gauge what work needs to be done, particularly in structure, because that's really as we talk in the book at length, words per se are much less important than the structure and the general ideas and how things hold together. But in this case, Stewart and Amy would work scene by scene. There was no rough draft of the libretto. It would be working from a treatment, more or less, like a film, but they would start with the scene. They would go back and forth, and they can talk to this, you know, much in more depth than I will here. But what is written in one scene would generally affect what was written. The music from one scene would affect what Amy would write in the text in the following scene. So in one way, it just built very organically, following their initial concept. In a way, sort of like a jazz score rather than a symphony. I mean, you have the structure, but you have a lot of room to improvise. And they did a lot of improvisation along the way. Many of the small details that at the end seem very obvious, right, like could not have possibly not been there to begin with. Chang being, you know, a major example, the death of Chang, came up along the way. So it was very much a process of discovery.
It seems like I remember that that, Stewart, you may have written for specific voices in this case, as opposed to writing a generic part. Would you tell us a little bit about
Sure.
that?
Well, I think it's always interesting. It's like anything in life. If you're working with somebody specific, you have their eccentricities, their nooks and crannies. Is this? I think there's a whistle from the sound system. Is that okay now? Better? I can talk without it too if you want. I don't mind.
You could probably tell us what pitch it was.
Amy can do that.
That was G.
But the joy for me is to work with people's peculiarities and their special gifts and the things that, it's like, for example, the mother who sings Luling has, is a mezzo, but she never shows off what I now have come to refer to as her chocolate bottom.
Oh, yeah.
She has this unbelievable dark, rich color. Now, she came to record the prologue, which was written before anybody was involved. That was written in my own kind of, just in my imagination. But when I heard her sing those lower notes, I said, how much lower can you go? And so she was singing, these are the things, which, it's close to middle C, and we kept taking down. I take her down to F, below middle C, and she has this voluptuous, really rich sound, and it brings out a whole other kind of character. I would never have known that.
Her
my
empty
seat, I
heart
couldn't-
is
Yeah.
where it got down to
Yeah,
her.
she goes, her empty heart, like that. I would have never written that if I didn't know her.
Yeah.
Well, see, from my seat, I could not see her. I thought it was a tenor at the beginning. I said, this is really something.
Control.
Yeah, it's very specific.
A contra-tenor.
I want to say something about Ken, though, which is not obvious in the fact that he wrote the book. Ken was also like the singers involved in the process. I mean, many of the people who we met with Ken. All the trips that we took with Ken. Ken was with us there. And so his position, I mean, is, one of observation, but it's not just observation, it's participant. He was a co-conspirator. He helped find things. We found things together. So his participation was also quite unusual. And we really had a community of people who made this happen. And it really took that.
Well, I would say, the thing is that Joanna and I have been involved in a lot of interesting projects, being China being what it is now.
Explain who Joanna is.
Joanna is my wife, who Stewart
Yeah.
introduced a little bit earlier.
Yeah, Joanna.
Joanna has served in the opera largely as the artist liaison for many of the Chinese artists that we brought over. But really along the way, we've worked with traditional, for the most part, my writing has been about what I call Western classical composed music, which I tend to focus on, music that's younger than I am. But in the large concept, it's all about what we have in the West. And there's a lot of Western composed, people writing composed music in China. But there's also a very rich urban classical tradition of Chinese opera and other narrative forms. There's a lot of music in the fields that is still, sometimes in danger of dying out because of the media. Joanna and I have been involved in recording processes there. When Stewart said, we want to hear village music. We want to hear funerals. We want to hear weddings.
I actually said, get me funerals.
Yeah, get me funerals. It's a little tricky, isn't it?
You can't just
No,
go to the
not
obituary
funerals.
pages, you have to actually...
May I come to your funeral, please?
Yeah.
And we talked to researchers, and we got a phone call back saying, your lucky day. 2 funerals.
Oh, yeah. We got funerals. And then everywhere we went, there were more of them.
Yeah, just drive around the countryside. Oh, there's a funeral.
Well, we're getting very close to having some audience questions. I just have to ask one more question. When I came into the room and saw the beginning of the opera, I said, this is spectacular. The scenery was going to be spectacular, and I thought, this could overwhelm what I thought was going to happen in the music and in the drama. But it didn't. It was really something else. I'm having a hard time describing that. I'm wondering, could you describe the sets for us a little bit and the varieties of Chinese, American opera scenes we might have seen in this?
Do you want to do that?
And by the way, did you have conception in the sets, and did you guys collaborate on that as well?
Well, not literally, no,
yeah.
but Chen Shizheng, the director, was involved also very early on, and he put a very strong imprint on the shape of the opera, this kind of very formal Chinese shape, because it's balanced. It's a prologue and two scenes, a prologue and two scenes. Where we started was not there. I tend to like things that are asymmetrical. And as I got deeper into this opera, I tried to find symmetries. And I did not push asymmetries unless I felt it was absolutely necessary. So the process of working this, certain formal Chinese concepts found their way into what I would do with it. So we knew certain things. We knew that there was a prologue. It was time out of time. It was this mythic place. We knew that it was in fog. So yes, what you see now, he decided that we knew that there were two dragons, a water dragon and a fire dragon. Now initially Shizheng, our director, was not interested in dragons. You could say maybe he didn't put dragons in there. You might say that too. But when we first said dragons, he said, oh no, no dragons, too cliche, no dragons. and he said, we should use a turtle. And I said, Shizheng, no turtles. And he said, no, turtles very important. I said, no turtles. So he sat there in this long pause, and then he said, okay, dragons. I said, good. He says, but these are not Chinatown dragons. These are flying dragons manipulated by Chinese acrobats. Ah, very good. You know, this was the way that things would happen. So now they're probably more abstracted fire and water than dragons that also paid. He didn't really do dragons after all. But, you know, this idea of, so these things evolved out of that. And actually the music that I wrote for the prologue, which has this sense of planing upwards, you know, you hear ba, ba, you hear all these things, was influenced by that visual, the idea that we would have acrobats moving like this, that we would have things floating into space. So I would say that a lot of these things happened organically. I mean, not literally, but the ideas really informed each other.
Does traditional Chinese opera make use of acrobats?
There is acrobatics. There is, a lot of the Beijing opera performers do acrobatics, but not in this way on wires and flying through space, no.
Well, it was just wonderful. This is a good time to have our questions. Thank you very much. It's also a good time for a commercial. And just to let you know that all of Amy's books are out in the vestibule. And if you would like to purchase those books and have Amy sign those for you, you can do that. Stewart's book is not out there because I wish we had your score so that we could purchase your score. One day we will.
There you go.
But Ken's book, The Fate and Luck and Chance, is also out there. And if you are going to purchase a book and have it signed, if you would just simply get that book, come back in here and sit down, and we will go row by row after the program is over, and then they will sign their books for you. This is a question for Stewart or Ken. Did the opera singers from China speak English before they got involved in The Bonesetter's Daughter?
Yes.
In a word, yes.
No, it's actually more complicated than that. The opera singers did. That means all the singers who were trained in Western opera. Chen Yi actually didn't speak a lot of English when I met her. And her English, since the time I met her in whatever it was, 2004 or 5, till now has improved markedly. And she also, you know, she would take me through various Chinese opera scenes and show me things, and I wanted to break them down so I could understand both not only what the words meant, but how the sounds of the words matched the sounds of the notes, so that I could understand how the whole effect was made. But she did not, her English has changed remarkably over that period of time.
Well, as has Wu Tong's.
Oh yes, no, that's true.
I met Wu Tong in August 2001, and at that point he knew about 5 words of English. And he was working with Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Ensemble. I met him in Germany, where he was really out of sorts there. And over the time, just by sheer force of will, he's learned, you know, a fair amount of English in his busy schedule, and he's learned that it's important to know that. And he still basically lives in Beijing, but has a green card for America. So I mean, he travels back and forth a lot.
Wu Tong is plays our mad monk and con artist and a number of things. The person who leads the dead back to a mortal heart. He's a rock and roll star, a rock star in China, heavy metal, and he also is, of his generation, the person preserving traditional Chinese music, the sheng, and he also plays a wonderful swana, which is a double-reeded instrument. But he's He's an amazing character.
He did a lot of things.
Yeah, he did.
Really
He's
stunning.
And he's never been in an opera before. So this is actually, he's never been in a theatrical production
He
before.
has a flair.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, he's got charisma to burn.
Yeah.
I'm very curious, too, about those, because looking at all of those characters that you put him in, he's always the agent of change.
yeah.
I mean, he leads people into the restaurant and where things, good and bad, really start to unfold. He leads people into,
To the world of the
and
dead,
back into
yeah,
China,
back
and leads people from Hong Kong to America,
Yeah.
in a way. I mean, was that a preconception, or is that something that just came along the,
Oh
the
yeah,
way?
yeah, that was.
There we go.
Amy, we have a question for you. By the way, at the bottom it says, "Thank you so much for this amazing story." That's not part of the question, but
Oh,
I think
thank
it's a
you.
very beautiful statement. Do you feel sad that your mother didn't live long enough to see the opera, or do you believe that she, like precious Auntie, is able to see and understand?
Oh, she's been here. You know, and I often feel her saying, she wasn't, some people will say, well, you know, how can you tell these secrets? Wouldn't your, you know, good thing your mother's dead, she'd be so angry. And I said, oh no, she'd be turning around saying, that's my story, you know, that's me. Oh yeah, that scene where I almost killed myself, that was me, you know. Or she loved these stories that were, had a lot to do with her, the emotions. And she would turn to people and say, oh, she was terrible, she was bad. And I said, I have to be patient. I learned all about patience, you know, from how bad she was. I think she's there, and I think my grandmother is there, the precious Auntie. There was a photo that you saw of a beautiful young woman, and that is my grandmother, who killed herself when she was 37.
And I believe those photos are in this book as well.
Yes.
And part of that too, so we get to see those. And Amy or Stewart, I understand the opera is sold out. Are there other events we can go to? Will other cast members be appearing at any of the events? And might I add, I believe it was filmed for public television the night I was there. Maybe it's several recordings, but tell us, are there other opportunities for us?
Well, there are. You know who's best to tell you is actually Joanna. Do you mind, Joanna? Because
Well,
Joanna knows.
let me
sorry.
mention one event coming up, very nice event, Book Passage. Book Passage on the 23rd. Tian, our coffin maker, is going to be there. His actual name is Tian Haojian, and he's written a book called Along the Roaring River, which is, his name means Roaring River. And he is amazing. I've read this book, and it reads like a novel. It's an incredible story of his life. But he will probably entertain us with little snippets of song.
He has a flair for the evil person too,
He
doesn't
does.
he?
You know, I mean, when he comes out, I remember the first time he came out to take his bow, and, you know, people started clapping, and then they started booing, you know, but it didn't mean that they thought he was so great. Every time he was on stage, they just loved, he was our comic character.
Will the program be on public television for us at some point?
Well, it's not. It won't be shown. At least not. We don't know that now as an opera now. But there will be the documentary, which you've seen some clips from, and that's supposed to be sometime next year in the spring, I think. So, and that will include things from the opera on stage, the process of making it, the travel to China, number of the elements you see here.
Do we know where the opera's going to go after San Francisco? Or you can't tell us, can you?
Not yet.
Oh, well, I was hoping to get that, but we didn't. Stewart, is it hard to combine American and Chinese music? Is the result two distinct styles or a new fusion?
Well, I would say none of the above. I never tried to make a bridge or to go native or to, you know, try to channel my inner Chinese person.
I've seen you in restaurants, Stewart. You try to channel.
Well, with
your
food, it's a
inner-
whole different thing.
Your inner woman.
Or my inner woman. No, I did try to channel that. What happened was, and I think this is the story of many of Amy's books, is I went to China. And going to China changed me. And it also opened up a realm of possibilities. I think meeting Zhonghua was the first part of that. And so I think I approached it in many ways similar to what Amy does, which is that I went there intuitively. I didn't try to dissect it academically or try to figure out what it was. I just listened And what I tried to do was find a way to incorporate certain timbres and textures, sense of space and ritual, in creating this world of the opera. So I never really thought about it as fusing East and West. I think that really more what happened is that those sounds became a part of me. And through that, they became a part of the opera. So that if a Chinese opera aficionado would hear this opera, they would never think of it as Chinese. They would know where the sounds came from. And so it creates this ironic situation in which, in some ways, because American music is ubiquitous through our popular culture, Chinese opera is not. It's not part of our world. So that in some ways, a person coming from China who knows Chinese opera would understand more some of the things that happened to those sounds in this, but they would never call it Chinese. I think it is an only in America kind of piece.
Yeah. It's American music thing.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
And you know, the best part of who we all are here is the things that come from so many places and get jumbled up and mishmashed up and made something new here by virtue of the best part of the American spirit. It's the thing that I'm always most hopeful about for our country and so frequently disappointed with.
Ken, Fate, Luck, Chance. It's kind of a strange title, this person says. Why did you choose it?
That was actually Amy's title.
Oh, Amy, why did you choose it?
That came up in a meeting, and of course, 6 months later, she said, "Where did we get that title?" I said, "Well, Amy, you brought that up." I said, "Well, I wasn't serious. That just, but Amy, we couldn't think of anything better."
That's because
it was a great title.
the title was going to be something like the collaboration
Creative collaboration.
between Stewart Wallace and Amy Tan on the making of it. It was sort of this long, boring thing. It's like, who's going to buy that book? And I said, you know, it has to be snappy, something, you know, like the kind of thing everybody wants, you know, kind of like Fate, Luck, Chance or something, you know. And then I went away and then I saw this book and it was like, what?
But it was really quite fitting. And one reason we couldn't find anything better was because it really captured the sense of the openness that they brought themselves to this project. And Stewart in particular. Now, Amy's been a veteran of traveling in China for years. Stewart is a veteran of travel, but this was his first time in China. And being a rather type A New Yorker at this point, he would come in with a schedule of things he wanted to do. And every time we went through that, it was about getting Stewart to put the schedule down and open himself up. And he had such a wonderful experience with Li Zhonghua on the first trip. We had a good sell at this point because if you'd followed your schedule, your original idea, you would have never spent time with Zhonghua. You would have never invited him for the production. All we had to do was say that, and at that point, Stewart would calm down. He would put his watch.
It wasn't that easy.
Well, okay. But we went through it and just opened up to that sort of sense. And what you have here, really, I'll say a little bit about Stewart beyond this, because what Stewart has done, he's a member of a generation of composers who are really the first group to unselfconsciously open the palette. You know, there was a time when if you wrote grown-up music, you had to pretend that you didn't play in rock bands growing up, or you didn't know popular culture. All of that you just left at the door, and you had a tradition that referred strictly to itself, Western composed music. And at this point, everything is fair game. And you can do rock, you can do jazz. And a lot of the great composers here in this country of this age have a broad tradition where they say, well, you know, we came from flamenco culture, we came from tango culture, we come from Peking opera. They can dig into that. What Stewart did when he went to China was take the same sensibility. Now, over here, we just had, you know, a heritage of your teachers telling you couldn't do it. Over there was several thousand years of a Confucian culture that said, no, cultivated tradition here, vernacular, village, rough stuff over here, and they never mix. And Stewart was there very consciously ready to mix them up. And in that way, that's, I think, ultimately why it's much more of an American experience than anything that anyone would write in China.
Stewart, he says, a type A New York person. You lived in Texas a while. How did that work, by the way?
I grew up in Texas, but I migrated to my spiritual home.
I see. I have it now. The last question we have is for Stewart. Are there plans to publish the opera either in piano vocal or orchestral score format?
Well, I do have a publisher, it's Schott.
Oh, Schott.
And they do publish the music for this. And they're also in charge of helping to coordinate future productions. There is also talk of doing sections of the opera as a concert work. So there are many different ways that it might be seen. I mean, my hope right now is that the opera itself will travel to many places. Sure. And I hope that they and you and whoever else will help us with that.
Yes, we hope we help you with that as well. Would you thank our guests for us this evening? Thank you.